I'm Lauren Hale, 33 years old, and I've learned the hard way that some birthdays feel quieter than they should, the kind of quiet that makes the walls hum. I was standing at my kitchen counter in Tulsa, staring at a phone that refused to light up. The day had slipped past without a call or a card, and I told myself I was used to it. The air felt heavy with something I didn't want to name. Then a notification pinged 2 days later and pulled me into a moment. I can't forget. There's a memory shaped like polished chrome and a smile that wasn't for me. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that moment knocked everything loose. Before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to keep your head high when someone made you feel small. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second child in a family that liked things picture-ready, where my father Richard built his supermarkets shelf by shelf, and my mother Paula could turn a bare hall into a ballroom with a swatch of fabric and a calendar full of clients. We were taught to shake hands, show up early, say thank you, and put in the work, even when no one clapped. Kindness and effort were the house rules. My brother Mason drew the spotlight without trying first, with a sleek red bike that glinted in our driveway, later with a set of keys pressed into his palm at 16, and eventually with a tuition bill paid without a pause, while I learned to braid my hair before dawn, catch the early bus, and make the most of what was mine. There was pride in what my parents built, and I don't take that away from them. The store lights came on at 5, the invoices went out, and dinner talk circled around vendor terms and big Saturday sales. But even as a kid, I noticed how faces softened when Mason walked into a room, how the stories bent toward him like sunflowers, and how my wins, debate trophies, A- report cards, and small scholarships sat quiet on the mantel until they were moved to make space. The first time I understood money could change the air in a room I was 10, and standing in an aisle my father had just finished resetting the smell of cardboard and citrus cleaner rising from the floor. He ruffled Mason's hair and said he'd make a place for him in the business someday. To me, he said, "You're steady in the way you might compliment a reliable car that starts in winter." Steady became my role. I studied, kept my head down, and learned to let praise roll right past me without breaking stride. When it came time for college, Mason packed for a private campus with new shoes and a weekend send-off, and I took a bus to a state school with a second-hand fridge and a list of night shifts, telling myself this was what grown-ups. Do you pay your way and skip the noise? Tulsa came later, a fresh start. I built one spreadsheet at a time, first in a modest apartment, and then finally a place with sunlight in the mornings, and a decent view of the river when the trees were bare. The city didn't ask me to be anyone's understudy. I became a senior analyst at 32, learned my neighbors' names, and found a coffee shop that knew my order without me saying a word. Money wasn't flying around, but the bills were paid, and there was a rightness to the rhythm work jog by the park called Denise on Sundays, buy lilies when the grocery display looked good. Tulsa is not Dayton, and that difference, the space to exhale, made me brave enough to admit the ache I'd carried from room to room for years. My parents didn't mean to be unkind, that's what I told myself, and sometimes that was true. They sent holiday photos with matching sweaters and asked if I needed anything in a way that sounded like a formality. But birthdays tell the truth. One year slipped by with a hurried text that landed the day after another with a card that never materialized, then a stretch so long it turned the calendar into a quiet ocean. I learned to bake my own cake or skip it altogether. I learned to smile when coworkers surprised me with a cupcake and a candle in the break room, the flame wobbling as if it knew something I didn't want to say out loud. Steady, I'd think, and blow it out, then get back to my desk and the numbers that never played favorites. Kindness was the soil I tried to grow everything in, even the cracked places. I called home when I could, offered up news in small servings, new client, new project, a weekend hike that cleared my head, hoping to meet my parents where they were. Our conversation slid easily back to Mason, his new project with Dad, a weekend tailgate, the way people lit up when he arrived. I listened, added the right noises, and told myself love doesn't keep score. But love does notice patterns. And patterns, when they go unspoken, begin to chafe like a tag at the back of your neck you can't quite reach. My 31st birthday started soft and ordinary. I made coffee, answered a few early emails, and set a small vase of lilies on the table because flowers don't ask for anything and give you beauty anyway. The day moved in a straight line: work, a walk, a call with Denise that made me laugh, and a quiet dinner I'd been looking forward to because I'd chosen every ingredient and paid for every part of it myself. When the phone stayed blank, I told myself to let it go, to keep my peace, to trust the life I'd built. The sky went from blue to that thin gray that makes the river look like brushed steel, and I washed dishes while the window fogged a little from the heat of the water. 2 mornings later, the world tilted without making a sound. I was standing at the counter again, mug warm in my hands, when my phone buzzed with a fresh notification. The screen showed a familiar name, a familiar grin, and a photograph so polished I could see the clouds reflected in metal. I wish I could tell you I didn't look, that I put the phone face down and walked away. But this is a story about truth. I looked, and what I saw, what everyone saw, pulled a thread. I'd been winding tight for years, and it didn't just loosen, it snapped. When I tapped the phone that morning, the image filled the screen so bright it made my eyes sting. Mason stood in front of a silver Tesla, grinning wide, one hand resting on the hood like it was a trophy. The caption read, "For someone deserving," and just below my name glowed blue in the tag. My stomach turned before my mind caught up. There were hearts, clapping emojis, a line of comments from friends and coworkers congratulating him, and right in the middle a reply from Mom. "So proud of you, sweetheart." Dad had added, "You've earned this, son." My name sat there at the top of it all, sharp and deliberate. I could almost hear the tone behind it, the careless jab of people who knew how to get under your skin without saying a word. I set the phone down, but it was too late. Every quiet birthday, every missed call, every half-hearted card came back at once. The silence over the years hadn't been an oversight. It had been a pattern. That morning, something in me clicked into place. I had spent 3 decades trying to earn what they gave Mason without question. Suddenly I saw it for what it was, a losing game. That night I made tea and sat at the small table by the window watching the traffic lights blink over the empty street. My phone lay face down beside me. I picked it up, once thumb hovering over Mom's contact, then over Dad's, but the thought of hearing their voices felt heavy, like trying to breathe through wet fabric. Instead, I opened my settings and started blocking numbers. Mom, Dad, and finally Mason. I did the same on social media, removing every connection that led back to them. Each click sounded louder than it should have, like a door slamming shut in an empty house. I told myself it was only temporary, a pause to find my footing, but deep down, I knew I wasn't coming back from this one. For a few days, the quiet was almost peaceful. No birthday reminders, no group messages, no quick check-ins that were really checkups. I woke early, went for a jog, and caught myself humming as I made breakfast. The weight I'd carried so long had begun to lift, even if just an inch. But the calm didn't last. By midweek, my office phone started ringing from unfamiliar numbers. My assistant Rachel poked her head into my office. "Your dad called," she said, eyebrows raised. "He said it's urgent." I asked her to take a message and thank him, but to let him know I was busy. The next day, a voicemail came through the office line. Mom's voice clipped and commanding. "Lauren, we need to talk. Call us back immediately." I deleted it before she finished her sentence. The tone wasn't concern, it was authority. They weren't used to being ignored, and I could hear the irritation in every word. That weekend, Denise called while I was folding laundry. "Your mom just messaged me," she said, her voice careful. "She wanted to know if you were okay." She paused. "She said they haven't heard from you, and they're worried." Denise had known me since we were teenagers. She knew better than to buy it. I asked her to ignore the message and not respond. "You got it," she said, "but they sound unsettled." A few days later, another call came from an old college friend, Holly. "Mason reached out," she said. "He's saying you're not answering anyone and they're scared something's wrong." I could hear the unease in her tone. I thanked her, told her I was fine, and asked her to stay out of it. By the time I hung up, I could feel the familiar pressure in my chest again, the same one that had built every time they'd found a new way to invade my space. The following morning, I got a notification from a private account on Instagram. The username looked generic, no profile photo. The message read, "Lauren, this is ridiculous. Unblock us and call home." It was signed Mom. She'd created a fake account just to get around my block. I blocked that one too, my hands shaking a little as I did it. It wasn't worry driving her, it was the loss of control. Their efforts began to spill into my real life. Tom, my landlord, called one afternoon. "Hey, your parents reached out," he said awkwardly, clearing his throat. "Wanted to know if you were still living here, said they were worried." He didn't sound convinced by their story. "I told them you were fine, but I figured you should know." I thanked him and hung up, staring at the wall until the clock ticked 5 minutes past the hour. Later that week, Nate, the security guard at my building, stopped me in the lobby. "Your dad called here," he said, scratching his head. "Sounded pretty anxious. Said you hadn't been in touch for weeks." I managed a tight smile, told him I was okay, and kept walking. By then, I could feel the heat of their reach pressing closer. They weren't just trying to find me. They were trying to pull the strings that had always worked before. What broke me wasn't a phone call, it was a tweet. I'd unblocked one of Mason's old accounts to check if he'd moved on, and instead I found a post that made my hands go cold. "Really worried about my sister," it read. "Haven't heard from her in a while. Hope she's safe." There was a photo of him looking somber, a coffee cup half full beside him. The replies came fast friends and strangers offering prayers, asking if I was missing some, even tagging me, wondering where I'd gone. I turned the phone over, pressing it against the table, as if I could stop the noise pouring through the screen. Mason wasn't worried. He was building a story. Over the next few days, it spread. Mom and Dad reached out to more of my friends, sending long messages filled with concern that always ended the same way: "She's just not herself lately." Then Aunt Carol joined in. I learned from Jenna that Mom's sister had been telling relatives I was having emotional issues. "She's saying you've been acting strange," Jenna told me, voice low, like she was afraid the words themselves could hurt. The lie moved fast through the family chats, faster than truth ever could. At work, I thought I was safe until Brian stopped by my desk one morning. "Your dad called one of our bank contacts," he said, his expression uneasy. "He asked about your accounts." They refused, of course, but he tried. My stomach dropped. That wasn't a call of concern. It was a probe, a way to check if I was where I said I was, to see if I'd moved money, maybe even left Tulsa. It made my skin crawl. That night, Mark sent me a text with a link attached. "You need to see this," he wrote. The link opened to a video Mason, again this time on TikTok, standing in front of a candlelit table with my name on a banner. His voice was heavy, almost mournful. "It's been months since we've heard from my sister," he said. "We're holding a small gathering tonight, hoping she knows we love her." In the background, Mom's hand rested dramatically on Dad's shoulder. It wasn't a memorial, it was theater. The comments rolled in, people calling it touching, asking if I was okay. Some offered advice on how to reach out to troubled family. I closed the app, my pulse racing. I hadn't gone missing. I hadn't done anything but draw a line and keep it. Still, they were painting me as the problem. When Jenna called again the next day, her voice trembled with guilt. "Lauren, they've told everyone you're struggling," she said. "Aunt Carol told the cousins you might need help." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was no longer about reaching me. It was about control, keeping the family narrative spotless, while I became the cautionary tale. I didn't fight back, not yet. I answered my work emails, made dinner, and kept my routine steady. But inside, I could feel the ground shifting, the old ache turning into something sharper. Every move they made told me the same thing: they couldn't stand not being in charge of my story. I watched from a distance as the rumor mill turned, gathering speed. That night, I sat at my desk, the light from my laptop pooling over the paper where I'd started writing weeks earlier. The outline had been just an idea, then a place to collect my thoughts. Now it felt like something else, something ready to take shape. I added a new line at the top of the document and wrote, "They said I disappeared." The truth is, I just stopped answering. Then I saved it and closed the laptop. I knew they'd keep pushing, maybe harder than before. But I also knew the next move was mine, and this time it wouldn't be quiet. The calls and rumors didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, reaching into corners of my life that should have been safe. At first, I told myself it would fade with time, but it only deepened, like a stain that spread every time I tried to ignore it. Every day brought a new message from someone who meant well, but didn't understand what was happening. "Your parents are worried sick," one coworker said after glancing at her phone. "You should just call them and clear things up." I smiled politely, pretending not to hear the judgment tucked inside her tone. I was tired of explaining, tired of carrying a story no one wanted to believe. One morning, Brian stopped by my office again, this time closing the door behind him. "Your dad called one of the bank reps," he said, lowering his voice. "He wanted to check on your accounts, see if there was any unusual activity." I felt my pulse quicken. They didn't give him anything. "Of course," he added, "but he's asking questions he shouldn't be asking." I nodded, trying to keep my expression steady, but inside I felt stripped bare. It wasn't curiosity driving him, it was control, the same kind that had defined every corner of my childhood. The next week brought another blow. Mark texted me during lunch telling me to check something online. I hesitated, already bracing myself, and then opened the link. It led to a short video of Mason filmed in the soft light of a dining room I recognized from our parents' house. The table was lined with candles, a banner with my name hung behind him. His voice was low, full of rehearsed sorrow. "It's been months since we've heard from my sister," he said, "and we just want her to know we love her and hope she's safe." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. Behind him, Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and Dad's hand rested on her shoulder like a stage cue. It wasn't a memorial, it was a performance. Within hours, comments filled the feed. Strangers offered sympathy, some even asking if I was in trouble. A few tagged me directly, urging me to reach out, as if I'd simply vanished without a trace. I turned off my phone and sat still for a long time. The quiet in my apartment pressed against me. It wasn't grief I felt. It was disbelief. How could people I shared blood with rewrite my story so easily? The next day, my cousin Jenna called. "Lauren," she said softly, "you need to know what's going around." I closed my eyes, listening as she explained how Aunt Carol had started telling people that I was struggling mentally, that I'd cut contact because I wasn't well. "She said you've been acting strange," Jenna went on, her voice shaking. "It's spreading through the family group chats." I could almost picture them, those digital whispers passing from phone to phone, reshaping my absence into something easier to digest. Concern sounded kinder than neglect. After that, I moved through my days like a shadow of myself. I went to work, met deadlines, and answered emails. But a quiet anger began to hum beneath the surface. I'd tried silence. I'd tried distance. But now they were pulling other people into the story, people who had no idea how deep this ran. I started keeping notes, small details that might have seemed unimportant to anyone else. The dates of phone calls, the names of people they'd reached out to, every rumor that found its way back to me. The list grew longer with each week. One evening I stayed late at the office, the hum of the copy machine filling the empty space. When I finally left, the streets were quiet, and the parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel. For years, I'd been the quiet one, the steady daughter, the responsible employee, the friend who never caused trouble. But as I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I saw someone else looking back, someone tired of being erased. When I got home, I opened my laptop and reread the document I'd been drafting in pieces since that morning in March. It started as a list, but now it was becoming something more, a full account of every slight, every humiliation, every time I'd been made to feel invisible. I added new sections about Mason's video, my father's call to the bank, my mother's messages to my landlord and security guard. Each word felt like a small act of reclamation. I didn't know what shape it would take yet, but I knew it would end with the truth. Over the next few weeks, the tension built quietly. Friends who once reached out began to pull back, unsure what to believe. Denise was the exception. She came over one Friday evening with takeout and a soft look that said she'd seen the gossip but refused to feed it. We ate in silence for a while before she said, "They're losing control of the story and they can't stand it." I nodded. She didn't need to explain further. She was one of the few who knew how long this had been brewing. The following Monday, I received a company-wide email from HR reminding employees about appropriate workplace boundaries and outside inquiries. My stomach dropped as I read between the lines. Someone from my family had contacted the firm. I found out later it was Dad asking if I'd been taking time off due to stress. The HR director assured me nothing would come of it, but it left me rattled. The boundary I'd built, fragile as it was, had been crossed again. That night, I found myself awake past midnight, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the city faint beyond my window. I thought about my parents' house in Ohio, the smell of lemon polish, the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the photographs of Mason on every wall. I could almost hear my father's laugh from the living room, my mother's voice floating from the kitchen, calling him to dinner. For a fleeting second, I missed them, the version of them I'd hoped they could be. Then I remembered the silence on my birthdays, the quick dismissals, the way they'd turned love into a transaction I could never afford. The ache softened into something quieter, something more resolute. When morning came, I made coffee and opened the document again. The page count had grown, and with it a strange sense of steadiness. This wasn't revenge, it was record-keeping. The truth unembellished and unedited. I wasn't ready to share it yet, but for the first time I knew I would. The story I'd been too afraid to tell had found its voice. I printed a copy and tucked it into a folder, setting it on the desk beside my laptop. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the glass. The day stretched ahead, full of its usual tasks, spreadsheets, calls, and meetings, but beneath it all, a shift had begun. They could say whatever they wanted. They could call whoever would listen. But sooner or later, the version they'd built would crack under the weight of what they'd done. I gathered my bag and keys, turning off the light as I left the apartment. The hallway was quiet, the air cool against my skin. For once, I didn't look back before locking the door. Whatever came next, I was ready to meet it head-on. By the time spring came to Tulsa, the noise from my family had begun to fade. The videos and messages slowed, though I still caught the occasional whisper through friends who meant well. It should have been a relief, but quiet doesn't always mean peace. I'd built walls so high I could barely see over them, yet somehow the hurt still slipped through. Work helped. Spreadsheets, deadlines, and meetings filled the hours, leaving less room for thoughts I couldn't control. But in the evenings when the apartment settled and the city went still, I could feel the ache in my chest return. It wasn't anger anymore, it was something deeper, something that felt like grief. One night after a long day, Denise came by with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said she wasn't leaving until I opened up. "You can't keep carrying this alone," she said. "You need someone who's not in it." She slid a card across the table. It had the name of a therapist, Dr. Laura Hayes, someone her coworker swore by. "Just try 1 session," she urged. "It's not about fixing them. It's about helping you breathe again." I hesitated, tracing the printed number with my thumb. It had been years since I'd let anyone step into my private mess, but something about Denise's tone left no room for argument. A week later, I called the number. Dr. Hayes' office sat on the top floor of a small brick building near downtown. The waiting room was simple, soft chairs, warm light, a faint smell of eucalyptus. When she greeted me, she had that steady calm that made you believe you could say anything, and she'd understand. I sat across from her, hands clasped in my lap, unsure where to start. She smiled gently. "Tell me what brings you here," she said. The words opened something I didn't know I'd been holding shut. I told her everything from the birthdays that passed unnoticed, to the photo of Mason with his Tesla, from the fake concern that followed, to the rumors that spread when I went silent. The story came out in pieces, not neat or rehearsed, just raw. She listened without interrupting, taking notes here and there, her expression never changing. When I finished, the room went quiet. She set her pen down and said softly, "You've been carrying a lot of pain that was never acknowledged." Her tone was matter-of-fact, not pitying. "It's no wonder you're exhausted." I stared at the floor, unsure how to answer. She continued, "What I hear is a pattern not just of favoritism, but of control. When you pulled away, they lost access to that control, and now they're reacting to the loss." It was the first time anyone had framed it that way. I'd always blamed myself for not being enough, for not understanding how to please them. Hearing her say it out loud made my throat tighten. "You're allowed to protect yourself," she added. "Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're clarity." We met every week after that. Dr. Hayes helped me untangle years of guilt, showing me how deeply I'd learned to minimize my own needs. She encouraged me to start writing not for them, but for me. "Put your feelings on paper," she said one afternoon. "Name what hurt you. Once it's outside of your head, it loses some of its power." That night, I opened the document I'd been compiling for months and began rewriting it as a story. Not a complaint, not a defense, just the truth as I lived it. At first it felt strange seeing my life written in full sentences, but the more I wrote, the more the fog lifted. I described the long silences, the calls I used to wait for the dinners where Mason's name filled every conversation. I wrote about how my father's approval was currency, something Mason always had in abundance, while I worked just to stay visible. I added the more recent years, the fake accounts, the video tribute, the gossip. Line by line, the pattern unfolded in front of me, and it was impossible to deny what it showed. When I brought the draft to Dr. Hayes, she read it quietly for several minutes. Then she looked up and said, "This is powerful, Lauren. This is your truth." She warned me that sharing it publicly might have consequences, but she didn't tell me not to. "What matters most," she said, "is that you do it for yourself, not as a weapon." Her words stuck with me. For the first time, the decision felt like mine alone, not something driven by anger, but by clarity. In the weeks that followed, I started to change in small ways. I deleted the photos I'd been keeping, just in case, the ones that reminded me of times they'd looked right through me. I began journaling each morning, writing one thing I was proud of, something my parents never praised, but that mattered anyway. Some days it was as simple as I cooked dinner and didn't overthink a thing. Other days it was, I didn't check Mason's page once. Each note felt like a brick laid toward something sturdier. Tulsa began to feel like home again. The coffee shop near my office started remembering my order, and the barista smiled when she saw me coming. I took long walks after work, letting the sun warm my shoulders, and sometimes I caught myself humming. The anger was still there, but it no longer ruled me. Dr. Hayes called it reclaiming peace in pieces. One evening after a session, I sat in my car outside her office watching the sky turn orange over the skyline. The city lights flickered on one by one, and I realized how far I'd come from that first day when I blocked their numbers and sat shaking at my kitchen table. I wasn't the same person anymore. The story I'd been writing wasn't just an account of neglect, it was a map of survival. That night I went home and opened the document again. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting. I added one final paragraph, a simple line that read, "I'm not lost. I'm just done waiting to be found." Then for the first time I scrolled back to the top and read it all the way through. It didn't sound bitter. It sounded like freedom. Dr. Hayes was right. I didn't need to rush. But as I reread the pages, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a calm sense of readiness. I wasn't sure when I'd share the story or who would read it first, but I knew it was close. The truth no longer scared me. Before bed, I closed the laptop and looked around the small apartment that had once felt too quiet. The silence was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer echoed with what was missing. It held room for what could come next. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, spilling across the table where my laptop sat open. I made coffee, sat down, and placed my hands on the keyboard. The cursor blinked once, steady and sure. Whatever came after this moment, I was ready to face it, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who finally learned to see herself. When I finally sat down to finish my story, I didn't plan on sharing it that night. I just wanted to see it through, to lay every piece of it down in order and make sense of what had happened. The cursor blinked at the end of the last sentence like a heartbeat, steady and sure. I read the pages once more, making small edits, tightening words until the story felt whole. When I was done, I saved the file and stared at the title, "The Daughter They Forgot." For a long time, I just sat there listening to the hum of my refrigerator. The apartment was quiet, but the silence no longer felt like punishment. I opened Reddit, logged into an old account I'd barely used, and hesitated. Dr. Hayes had told me to share it only if I was ready. I wasn't sure what ready meant anymore, but I knew it wasn't fear holding me back. It was the weight of finally being heard. So I took a breath and hit post. The story went live just after midnight. By morning, my phone was lighting up with notifications. Comments came in faster than I could read them. People telling me they understood that they'd lived through the same kind of favoritism, that they were proud of me for speaking up. Strangers shared stories of siblings who took everything while they were left behind. Each message felt like an echo, a chorus of people who had once been silenced. By noon, the post had spread beyond the thread. It landed on other platforms, screenshots and quotes appearing across feeds and pages I didn't even follow. My stomach flipped as I realized how many eyes were reading my life, but instead of panic, I felt a strange calm. For the first time, the truth wasn't hidden in quiet rooms or whispered to a friend. It was out in the open, where it belonged. That evening, I called my cousin Jenna. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "Can you send this link to Mom, Dad, and Mason?" She hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You can't take this back." "I'm sure," I said. "They deserve to see it from me, not from someone else." She sighed and promised she would. A few hours later, she called back. "They saw it," she said quietly, "and they're not handling it well." She told me Dad was furious, worried about how it would affect the family business. Mom called it a betrayal, saying I'd humiliated them in front of their friends. Mason had texted her too angry and defensive, claiming I'd exaggerated everything. I listened unmoved. None of it surprised me. I thanked Jenna for letting me know and asked her not to get caught in the middle. "I won't," she said, "but I think this is just the beginning." She was right. Within a day, local pages in Dayton picked up the story connecting details to my parents' businesses. Customers left comments under photos from Mom's event company, asking how she could plan celebrations while ignoring her own daughter. A few of Dad's grocery stores received negative reviews accusing him of favoritism and poor ethics. It spread faster than I expected, and the fallout was real. At work, Brian mentioned seeing a post that sounded a lot like mine. "If that's you," he said quietly, "I just want you to know it took guts." I thanked him and got back to my spreadsheets, pretending the world wasn't changing outside those office walls. But every time my phone buzzed, I felt that mix of fear and freedom again, like standing in the middle of a storm you'd spent your whole life avoiding. By the end of the week, Jenna called again. "Mom sent me a long email for you," she said. "She says you've misunderstood everything, that they never meant to hurt you." I asked her not to forward it. A few hours later, she called again, this time about Dad. "He left a voicemail on my phone," she said, sounding weary. "He said you exaggerated, that you owe them a chance to explain." Then came Mason's message, a demand that I take the post down because it was ruining his life. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't delete the post. I'd spent too many years being quiet. Now that the truth had a voice, I wasn't silencing it. The next few days were a blur. Support poured in from strangers who called me brave, and every comment I read reminded me that I wasn't alone. People told me the story had given them courage to confront their own families, to set boundaries, to stop apologizing for being hurt. I didn't write back, but I read every word. It was strange how validation from people I'd never met could mean more than years of waiting for approval from the ones who raised me. Meanwhile, the fallout at home deepened. Jenna said Mason stopped showing up at Dad's company, too embarrassed to face coworkers who'd read the post. Some called him entitled behind his back. Others unfollowed him online. Mom's event business lost several contracts after clients saw the story connected to her. Dad's stores took a financial hit too, with vendors hesitating to renew agreements. Their perfect image was cracking, and there was no quiet way to patch it. Through it all, I stayed silent. I went to work, met friends, and let the days move forward. When the phone rang, I didn't answer. When emails came, I deleted them unopened. Dr. Hayes reminded me that silence could be its own kind of strength. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," she said. "You told the truth. The truth doesn't need defending." Still, there were moments when the reality of what I'd done caught up with me. One night, I sat in bed scrolling through messages from strangers. Some thanked me. Others simply said they were sorry. A woman from Michigan wrote that my story gave her the courage to walk away from her parents' manipulation. A man from Oregon said he finally understood why his sister had cut contact years ago. I read their words until the screen blurred. When Jenna called again a week later, her tone had softened. "They've stopped trying to reach you," she said. "I think they've realized you're not going to budge." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Thank you for keeping me updated," I said. "But you don't have to anymore." She hesitated before replying. "You sound different, Lauren." "I am," I said. And I meant it. The world kept moving, and so did I. My story was still being shared, but I didn't check the numbers anymore. The noise had served its purpose. It carried the truth farther than I ever could on my own. What mattered now was what came after. One evening as I walked home from work, the sky stretched wide and gold over the city. I passed a family laughing outside a cafe, a mother chasing her little girl across the sidewalk. It didn't sting the way it used to. I just watched for a moment, smiling faintly, before continuing down the street. I'd stopped wishing for the life I didn't have. I was finally building one of my own. That night I opened the original document again, scrolling to the last page. Beneath the final line, I added a single sentence. I didn't write this to break them. I wrote it to free myself. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle around me. Outside, the city glowed under the streetlights, steady and alive. I sat by the window, feeling the air move gently through the open pane. The story was out there now, unchangeable, undeniable. And while my family was still reeling from the truth, I was ready to start something new. The next chapter wasn't about them anymore. It was about me and what it meant to finally live unburdened. Summer arrived heavy and bright in Tulsa. The air smelled of cut grass and rain, and the sidewalks shimmered in the heat. By then, the noise from my family had quieted, replaced by the hum of their consequences. Jenna kept me updated, though I asked her not to share every detail. Still, bits of it slipped through. Mason had stepped away from Dad's company, saying the environment had become too tense. Mom had lost 2 major clients after a local blog connected her name to my post. Dad's grocery chain was struggling with vendors pulling out. The family that once seemed untouchable was now cracking one layer at a time. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just kept living. Work filled my days, and weekends found me in familiar places: at the farmer's market, walking by the river, reading at the cafe that knew my order by heart. People still reached out from time to time, strangers who'd read my story and wanted to say it gave them courage. Their words meant more than I could explain, but I didn't write back. I'd said what I needed to say once. That was enough. It was on one of those quiet weekends when Jenna called again. Her voice sounded uncertain. "They're trying to get a message to you," she said. "Mom especially. She says she wants to make things right." I didn't answer right away. The thought of opening that door again made my stomach tighten. "She sent a letter," Jenna added. "It's not long. Do you want me to forward it?" I told her no. I didn't need to read excuses wrapped in apology. "Okay," she said softly. "Just thought you should know." After that call, I found myself thinking about them more than I wanted to. Not out of anger this time, but out of something quieter. The damage had already been done. Nothing they could say would change what had happened. Still, a small part of me wondered if silence between blood ever really ended, or if it just settled like dust. One evening, I met Denise for dinner at a small restaurant downtown. She listened as I told her about Jenna's call. "They're not used to consequences," she said, stirring her drink. "You finally held up a mirror and they don't like what they see." I nodded, watching the city lights blur through the window. "Do you think I should respond?" I asked. She thought for a moment before answering. "Only if it's for you, not for them." That night, back in my apartment, I reread my post for the first time in months. The words felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else, but as I read through the comments, one stood out. It was from a woman who wrote, "I thought I was alone until I found your story. You reminded me that silence doesn't have to be survival." I sat with that for a long time. Maybe that's what this had all been about. Not revenge, not justice, but survival turned into truth. In late July, a letter arrived in my mailbox postmarked from Dayton. The handwriting on the envelope stopped me cold. It was my mother's, unmistakable in its loops and curves. I brought it inside, set it on the counter, and stared at it under the kitchen light. Hours passed before I finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were careful, measured. She said she was sorry if I ever made you feel less loved. She said the post had embarrassed the family, but also opened her eyes. She ended with, "You're still my daughter. Please come home." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope without finishing it. There was no anger, just a deep quiet that settled through me. Apologies that arrive after exposure rarely come from reflection, they come from loss. I left the letter on my desk and didn't touch it again. A week later, Dad left a voicemail on my work phone. His tone was clipped professional even. "Lauren, I'd like to have a conversation when you're ready," he said. "We've been through a lot. Maybe it's time we clear the air." I listened once and deleted it. I knew that voice. It wasn't remorse, it was damage control. Still, not everything that came out of that storm was bitter. One morning, Dr. Hayes mentioned a local nonprofit looking for volunteers to teach basic finance to young adults recovering from family trauma. She thought of me, she said, because I'd turned pain into purpose before. I agreed to meet with the director. A month later, I was teaching a small class once a week, helping people build budgets, plan for independence, and understand credit skills I'd once had to learn alone. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave meaning to the space that pain had left behind. My life in Tulsa began to settle into a rhythm again. The mornings came easy, the nights were restful. I was moving forward, even if small reminders still lingered. Sometimes I'd see a family at the grocery store and catch a familiar look between a father and daughter, the kind of quiet pride I'd spent years craving. Other times, I'd scroll past photos of Mason's old life frozen smiles and expensive dinners that once defined our family's worth. They didn't sting anymore. They just existed like old photographs left in a drawer. Then one evening, Jenna called again. Her voice was hesitant. "You should know Dad's stores might close a few locations." The fallout hit harder than they expected. I listened quietly. "They're blaming you, of course," she added, but not out loud anymore. I thanked her for letting me know and told her I hoped they'd figure things out. When I hung up, I stood by the window watching the last of the sunlight slip behind the skyline. I didn't feel guilt, only a strange sense of distance. The consequences belonged to them, just as the silence now belonged to me. Later that night, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and thought about how far I'd come from that first moment when Mason tagged me in his photo. I remembered the sharpness of that humiliation, the anger that followed the quiet resolve that built from it. The woman sitting here now felt like someone else, someone whole. Dr. Hayes once told me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live without the need for approval. I understood that now. I wasn't waiting for a phone call, a letter, or a message anymore. My worth no longer lived in their recognition. It lived in my choices, my work, and the life I'd built on my own terms. Before bed, I looked at the unopened envelope still sitting on my desk. The paper inside had begun to yellow slightly at the edges. I picked it up, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it into the trash. There was no ceremony, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that I didn't need to hold on to what never truly held me. Outside, a soft rain started to fall, tapping against the windows. The sound was steady, almost rhythmic. I turned off the lights and let the darkness fill the room, knowing the next chapter would come on its own, without force or fear. I didn't need to chase closure anymore. It had already found me in the life I'd built far from the noise. And though I couldn't see it yet, the next turn was already waiting, something unexpected that would test just how much peace I had finally learned to keep. It was early fall when the call came, one of those crisp evenings when the air finally cools after a long summer. I'd just finished dinner and was sorting through work emails when my phone buzzed. It was Jenna. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I know you said you didn't want updates," she said, "but something happened. You should probably know." There was a long pause before she added, "Your dad's stores. A few of them have closed permanently. They're talking about filing for bankruptcy." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I stared at the ceiling, the light from my laptop washing the room in blue. "Are they okay?" I asked finally. "Financially, not really," Jenna said. "Emotionally, they're worse. Mason's been staying with them again. Things are tense." I thanked her and told her to keep me out of it as much as possible. "I just thought you'd rather hear it from me than through someone else," she said softly. "I know," I told her, and we hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the hum of the air conditioner, my mind restless. For years I'd pictured them as untouchable, always composed, always proud. Now for the first time, they were living with the cracks they'd ignored for so long. It didn't feel satisfying. It felt heavy. Over the next few days, news traveled fast. Dayton wasn't a big place, and word of the store closures spread quickly. Local papers ran small stories about the family-owned chain struggling to recover from reputation damage. I read one of them online, my father's name printed beside words like loss and decline. It was surreal. The same man who once prided himself on being in control was now fighting to stay afloat. A week later, I came home to find an envelope slid under my door. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a folded note and a check for $10,000. The note read, "I know I owe you more than this, but it's a start. M." I sat at the table for a long time, the paper cool in my hands. Mason's gesture caught me off guard. After everything, I didn't expect anything from him, not money, not acknowledgement, not even remorse. The next morning, I took the check to the bank and donated the full amount to the nonprofit where I'd been volunteering. The teller looked surprised when I handed her the form. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Every cent," I said. It felt like the right way to close that loop, to turn something that had once represented favoritism into something that could help someone else find stability. Later that week, Dr. Hayes asked about the check. I told her what I'd done. She nodded, thoughtful. "You didn't react out of anger or guilt," she said. "You made a choice that aligned with who you are now." Her words settled over me like a quiet truth. The anger that used to drive me was gone. What remained was clarity. Then one Sunday morning, my phone rang again. It was an unfamiliar number from Ohio. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Lauren." The voice said, hesitant but familiar. It was my mother. "Please don't hang up." I didn't say anything at first. She continued. "We lost the house." Her words tumbled out in short bursts. "Your father's company is gone. Mason moved out last week. I don't know where to go." The silence on my end stretched long enough for her to start crying. I could hear the panic in her breathing, the same sharp edge I remembered from my childhood when things didn't go her way. I closed my eyes, listening. "I'm sorry for how things turned out," she said between sobs. "I just wish we could start over." When she finally stopped, I took a slow breath. "Mom," I said quietly, "I hope you find peace. I really do. But I can't fix this for you." There was no anger in my voice, only calm. She tried to protest, but I ended the call gently before she could. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. The line between compassion and self-preservation had never felt so thin. That evening, I walked along the river near my apartment. The water reflected the streetlights, and the air carried a chill that hinted at winter. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for their approval, the countless times I'd tried to be seen. And now, after everything, it was them looking for recognition from me. A few days later, Jenna called again. "They're leaving Dayton," she said. "Aunt Carol's taking them in for a while. They've been keeping quiet, avoiding people." I thanked her for telling me, but asked not to hear more. "Of course," she said softly. "I think they finally realize you meant what you said." Life in Tulsa continued steady and full in a way it had never been before. I was promoted at work, leading a new department. My evenings were spent teaching classes at the nonprofit, helping others gain the kind of independence I'd fought to build. Denise came over most weekends, and we'd cook dinner laughing about small things. The quiet was no longer lonely, it was peaceful. One afternoon after class, I stayed behind to help a young woman named Clara review her budget worksheet. She reminded me a little of myself at 20, careful, determined, still unsure of her place in the world. "You make it sound simple," she said, smiling shyly. "It took me years to figure it out," I told her. "But once you learn your own worth, everything changes." When she left, I stood alone in the empty classroom for a moment, feeling the weight of how far I'd come. The following week, I received a short message from Mason. It wasn't handwritten this time, just a text. "I know we can't fix the past, but I hope you're okay. You were right about everything." I read it twice, then set the phone down without replying. Some things didn't need answers. Acknowledgement was enough. That night, I sat on my balcony with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, the city lights stretching out below. The air smelled of rain again, and for a moment I thought about my family, where they might be, what their days looked like now. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them back either. I wished them understanding, the kind that takes years to earn. When I went inside, I noticed the check stub still pinned to the fridge, the donation receipt attached beneath it. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about value, the kind that isn't measured in what people give you, but what you learn to give yourself. I turned off the lights, letting the apartment go dark, except for the faint glow from the city outside. My story had started with neglect and silence, but somewhere along the way it had become something else, a reminder that truth once spoken can outlast even the loudest denial. And as I stood there, I knew the final chapter was near, not an ending, but a quiet reckoning that would bring everything full circle. The first cool wind of winter rolled through Tulsa the week I turned 34. I noticed it while walking to my car after class, the way it lifted my hair and made the air smell sharp and clean. For the first time in years, I didn't dread that date on the calendar. I didn't wait for a message that would never come. My birthday had become mine again, quiet, simple, and whole. That night, I invited Denise over for dinner. We cooked together in the small kitchen, laughing about how we still couldn't time pasta right. When she asked how I wanted to celebrate, I told her I already was. There was something peaceful about sharing a meal without expectations, without anyone trying to prove anything. After she left, I stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement. The life I'd built, steady, honest, small, in the best way, felt exactly right. A few weeks later, I received a letter forwarded by Jenna. It wasn't long, just a page written in my father's handwriting. He thanked me for not returning Mom's call, said it helped them understand that some damage couldn't be undone. He mentioned Mason was working at a local food bank, now said he seemed quieter, less certain of himself. At the bottom he wrote, "We thought success meant control. You proved it's something else entirely." I read it twice before folding it neatly and tucking it away. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was recognition, and that was enough. Life found its rhythm again. Work was busy but rewarding. My class at the nonprofit grew, and Clara, the young woman I'd mentored, was now teaching her own sessions. Watching her stand confidently in front of others made something in me settle, as if the good I'd fought for had finally started to multiply. Sometimes after class, she'd stay behind and talk about her plans. One evening, she said, "I want to help other girls who were told they weren't enough." I smiled and told her she already was. Dr. Hayes liked to say that peace doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly like dawn. I started to understand what she meant. I no longer measured my worth in the attention of people who refused to see me. My value lived in the life I'd created, the people I chose, the calm I earned. There was no more noise, no more waiting for approval, just clarity. One Sunday, I drove out to the edge of the city where the road opened into miles of gold grass. The wind bent through it like a wave, and the sky stretched wide and endless. I parked by a small overlook and sat there for a long time, thinking about everything that had led me here, the silence, the anger, the courage it took to finally speak. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. For years, I thought justice meant watching my parents admit they were wrong. But standing there, I realized it was simpler than that. Justice was peace. It was being able to breathe freely without wondering who would try to take that from me next. It was waking up each morning knowing I didn't have to earn love by shrinking myself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt something lift, like the last thread of the past finally letting go. The road ahead wasn't about rebuilding what had been lost. It was about continuing to grow into the person I'd fought to become. I started the car, rolled down the window, and let the cold air rush in. The music played softly, steady as my heart beat, and I drove back toward the lights of the city that had become my home. When I walked into my apartment that night, I paused for a moment at the doorway. The space felt warm, lived in. There were photos on the shelf, friends, coworkers, my class, even a few snapshots from hikes I'd taken alone. Not a single one featured the people who'd once defined me, and yet I didn't feel their absence. I felt full. Before turning in, I wrote a note in my journal. Peace doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing yourself anyway. I smiled as I closed the cover, the sound of rain beginning to tap softly against the windows. That's the truth. I wish I'd known sooner that peace isn't something people hand you when they finally understand. It's something you claim when you stop asking to be seen. If this story finds you in that quiet place between hurt and healing, I hope you remember this. You don't have to wait for their apology to move forward. You can begin again right where you are. And if you've made it here with me, take a moment to breathe. Share your thoughts if you feel moved to, and if this story reminded you of your own strength, stay a while. There are more stories to tell, and every one of them begins with choosing yourself.